fasten your seatbelts and let's start the tour.
Thank you, Mary. We start today with an overview of the LNG as a long-term transition fuel before Pat and I take you on an international tour of 30 LNG import and export facilities located in the big countries. Not everybody around this table is familiar with LNG, so in 30 seconds, LNG starts with an upstream onshore or offshore gas production, as you can see on screen, where it is liquefied in an LNG plant with liquefaction trains that drops the temperature from ambient temperature to minus 162 degrees. It is then transported internationally across borders and an ocean to a receiving terminal where we will see some storage tanks from where it is fed into either an application of power or heat or industry. But let's just stand back, as we always do, and ask ourselves, what role does LNG play in the global energy system? And we see on the same scale drawn here, according to the data of Our World in Data, the major contributors to international energy supply on a daily basis in primary energy form. Oil remains the largest, as you can see in the period 2000 to 2022. Coal, the second largest. Natural gas, the third largest. And then biomass and hydropower, followed by slightly declining nuclear. And then you see, in terms of primary energy, top right, wind and solar and modern biofuels for their contributions. But our focus today is on gas. And as the headline on the slide shows, gas is 24% of primary energy on this Thursday that we meet. And it comprises 12% domestic gas and just about equal shares, although that has changed as a result of the war in Russia and Ukraine, to about equal shares of LNG, 6%, and international pipelines, also about 6%.
Hello everyone, it's Pat Roberts here, and I'd like to first of all welcome you all to this. And you'll see here a slide which is basically color-coded to show areas of the world where gas demand has already peaked by decade, and others which are due to peak in the next 10 or 20 years or so. And the big ones to pick out here is that in areas such as Europe and Australia and Japan, we've already seen peak gas demand. But progressively in the USA, that will happen, we expect, in the 2030s. But a very large part of the world, particularly including China and India, we are seeing as reaching peak demand in 2040, a direct response to their own energy transition pathway.
If we for a moment consider gas in the context of the energy trilemma of the World Energy Council, and that is also the deciding criterion for most cabinets of the world, I would say, of energy security, energy equity, including price and environmental sustainability. The three headlines of LNG and natural gas is that there is resource availability for another 5 decades from natural gas, that the international shipping routes are in place, and that there is considerable diversity of supply, as Pat will show in a moment, and that there's no cartel. Secondly, gas to power is more flexible and lower cost than the other significant source of power, which is talked about in terms of the future, nuclear. And as far as the environment is concerned, gas does better than coal in terms of both greenhouse gas emissions and particulates, but does worse than hydro and nuclear and renewables when it comes to greenhouse gases. And that, in some ways, is where the LNG that we're going to be talking fits into the global energy system.
Okay, so this slide here, a very messy looking chart when you first look at it, but it's got quite a lot of interesting data on it. Last year, globally, we produced and imported around 402 million tons of LNG. And the top 5 producers are shown here on the left-hand side of the chart. And the top 5 importers and importing regions are on the right-hand side. And what you'll see here is that around 75% of the world's supply in 2023 was produced by these 5 producers, and around 80% of all of the sales were to these 5 regions shown on the right-hand side. What turns out is that from this messy chart, you'll see that LNG is moving all around the world, and the thicker the lines, the more volume that is going from source to market. The USA and Qatar have virtually supplied every importing market there is. And USA is the biggest exporter and is expected to stay that way well into the 2030s. And China is going to be the biggest LNG importer in the world by country. But you'll see as the region here, we've collectively put Europe together as 121 million tons of imports last year. And actually, it's Europe where we're going to start on our demand. Europe has destabilized markets in the last couple of years, a direct response here to a switch from Russian gas into other sources of gas, and also particularly LNG. Now, here's a map showing you the buildup of where Europe gets its natural gas supply. There's Russian pipeline gas, and all of those exports to Europe have been minimized following the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine. The Nord Stream pipeline has also been terminated. There's no gas supply flowing through Nord Stream 1 or 2. The North Sea also produces gas by pipeline into Europe, as too does Norway. And we've got Algerian pipeline gas also being supplied into Europe. But the big one that I want to concentrate on today is the last one here, which are the LNG imports from the USA, Russia, Africa, and the Middle East. And in fact, last year, the USA supplied about 45% of all of the LNG which came into Europe. Now, this chart here just shows you a really big dispersion of all of the regasification facilities which are currently operating in Europe today. There's around 225 million tons of regas capacity. And as I said, last year they imported collectively around 120 million tons. There's 25 million tons of new capacity which is under construction, and in countries such as Germany, Estonia, Finland, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And this dispersion of facilities, roughly speaking, around, I would say, 60% of all LNG imports into Europe are in Northwest Europe, and about 40% are in the Mediterranean area. And our tour now takes us to Brunsbüttel in Germany. Actually, sorry, beg your pardon, it takes us first to the Isle of Grain. So the Isle of Grain was the UK's largest LNG facility, and in fact, the largest in Europe. And it doesn't stop there, it is continuing to expand. It's currently supplying around 20% of UK's gas demand, and that's going to rise to around 30% with its current expansion of 9 million tonnes per annum. It's offered third-party access services through an auction all the way through to the mid-2040s. And companies like Sonatrach and Venture Global from the US, have both signed 15-year, 3 million tonnes access agreements. Specifically for Venture Global, it's referring to itself now as a strategic supplier of LNG to Europe. Now, clearly, LNG is going to move to countries which are bidding the most for it. But having a lot of firm capacity, which is what Venture Global has taken, is a very definite market import capability for the company. I'm now moving to Brunsbüttel, and that is one of the new terminals, one of the several new terminals that Germany has sanctioned. And Germany is quite a case study here. You'll see the carrier on the right-hand side, which is bringing LNG into the country, and the FSRU, which is there as the floating storage and regas unit. And Germany is interesting because it's gone from 0 capacity in 2021, rising up to 52 BCMA by 2028. In total, it's planning 6 FSRUs and up to 3 land-based terminals. The government either owns all or part of them, and they plan to privatize them all by 2030. This is all to secure short and mid-term gas supply and to become as independent as possible from gas imports from Russia. And you can see here that the build out of this structure is something which a lot of people say, is it temporary or is it actually going to be something longer term? And that's a really key important point here, because for new liquefaction capacity, the question really comes down to how much can we rely on Europe as a long-term importer of gas? So our tour now takes us to a lot of European gas-fired power plants, and they play a real vital role in power system stability. The main role of these plants is to provide grid stability, particularly as several countries on this map are ramping up their renewable capacity. Now, you'll see that there are none here in France or Poland, but actually the build out of all of these CCGTs, we see them growing particularly in Germany, in Greece, in Italy, Ireland, and the UK. So we're going to visit 2 now. The first one is in Keadby in north of England. And here it is, Keadby 1 and 2. And what is important, I think, to mention here about its efficiency and how modern it is probably the most efficient gas-fired power plant in Europe today at around 63%. It's one of the cleanest gas-fired power plants in the world with respect to emissions of nitrogen oxides and carbon dioxide, and very well below European Union's own limits. So it's located up in the north of England, in North Lincolnshire, and has a generating capacity of 893 megawatts. Now we're going to go to a slightly different part of Europe. We're going right across to northern Greece, in fact, and we've highlighted here an example of a new business model, partly in response to diversifying away from Russian gas, but to do more than simply just supply Greece with LNG. What we've got here is the Alexandroupolis FSRU, and the idea of this particular project is not only to supply Greece, but to act as a corridor for landlocked countries. And you'll see in the top right-hand side of this diagram, the various plans that there are to not only import LNG for Greece, but also to sort of extend northerly along a long corridor, north and west. Now, this is the first of the projects which has actually started commissioning already in January of this year. And along with the land-based terminal Revituza, it's going to help Greece and Bulgaria certainly disengage from Russian gas within a year or so. There's going to be plans for more FSRUs as well. And the whole idea is to build this out into a regional hub. And I was actually in Athens in December when this was just really starting to be commissioned. There's plans here to make this a very long-term business. With diversification in mind, we also look at another terminal, a terminal here in Klaipėda in Lithuania. And again, you'll see the aerial view showing you the FSRU. And that FSRU was brought in, called the Independence, and its primary objective was to create independence and diversity from Russian gas for Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And that's precisely what it's done. It's a 3 million ton per annum unit, and it imports now around 100% of Lithuania's requirements for gas. Diversification is a very strong theme in Europe at the moment, and you would say that Lithuania had that foresight. Well, also so too did Poland. And the Świnoujście LNG receiving terminal in Poland is also another great example of reducing not just dependence on Russian gas, but also migrating out of coal as well. You'll see on this aerial photograph the offloading section of the terminal, which is down on the sort of bottom half of this chart, and also the storage tanks. That's been expanded in the last couple of years. And at the moment, I would say there is no Russian gas going into Poland, and a complete switch long term for the next 15 or 20 years has been made into Qatari and US LNG.
Thank you, Pat. We turned to the largest exporter last year, as Pat showed earlier, the USA, with three headlines. The first one that it has surpassed Australia and Qatar. Most of its sales are Henry Hub spot price linked, and that new developments have been paused by the Biden government, as we will see in a moment. When we first look down at United States and look at the 7 operating plants that produced 83 million tons last year, from Cove Point in the northeast all the way to Corpus Christi and Freeport and Sabine Pass and Calcasieu Pass, and also Cameron and Elba Island around the country. But that is by far not the end of the US story. And what you see in the yellow block are those plants that have already been approved by FERC and are under construction. A further 80 million tons of LNG at Sabine Pass, Plaquemines, Driftwood, Corpus Christi, Port Arthur, Rio Grande, and Calcasieu Pass expanding. And then there is the third tranche of US LNG that we see on the left, and that is approved but not yet under construction. And several of these plants have now been paused for a while, some say for a year. It's clearly electioneering in terms of and limitations on where that LNG can flow to if it's not a free trade agreement country. Let's visit 2 of the plants in the United States. We first go to the leader, really built by Cheniere, Sabine Pass. And you look down on the 6 trains where you see LNG trains at Sabine Pass. And you see in the background the storage tanks, and then you see the LNG carriers loading. And those LNG carriers can now leave from Sabine Pass and either go through Panama or across the Atlantic, or some of them go through the Suez Canal on their way to markets in Asia. And this has been a tremendous success story for Cheniere. Our second visit is this plant, the most talked about, the most controversial plant in the world in LNG right now, or at least outside of Russia, which is Venture Global's Calcasieu Pass. This plant has already delivered 250 cargoes, and if you ask why is it controversial, it is because Venture Global says this plant is not commercial yet, and recently Shell and BP and Galp of Portugal and Eni of Italy have all started arbitration claims against Venture Global for this. But a tremendous success story, and on screen you can see the modular LNG trains that were built in just over 30 months. You can see the 2 big LNG storage tanks, and you can see the LNG loading facilities. We leave the United States, and Pat, back to you to take us to China.
Thank you. And China is probably one of the most exciting sort of countries in terms of its LNG demand growth, not just in the past, but also what's going to happen next in the future. So let me try and explain the story. China has got lots of options for gas supply. It has its own indigenous domestic production. It has pipelines which are feeding in from Central Asia and also from Myanmar, and the power of Siberia, which comes in from the north from Russia. So these pipelines are already in operation. But what we're going to be talking about now is very much those LNG import terminals. There are so many which are in operation, and also a lot that are planned. Now, as a country, gas is just 8.5% of the total fuel mix in China. And the government's intention is to raise it to somewhere between 11 and 15% by 2030. And consumption is growing as well. So put those 2 things together and you get probably one of the biggest potential growths in LNG in the world. Pipeline imports are certainly crucial, but the reliance on LNG is rising. As a country, China imported 71 million tons per annum last year in 2030. And there's a lot of expectation that that will grow towards 100 million tons by 2030 as a simple base case. There could even be upside on that. Domestic production is steady. There's certainly no end of recoverable reserves at around 350 TCF, but it's the LNG part here that we'll be focusing on our tour. Before I get to that, a lot has been talked about Russia and its Power of Siberia 2, which is another big pipeline system coming in, particularly as Russia pivots away from sales to Europe. But that is some years off the pace. What we're going to focus on now, I think, is the LNG story that I think is quite compelling, providing that LNG can be affordable, and you'll hear us later on talk about why we believe that's the case. China has huge potential to import a lot more LNG. So let's have a look. We've got 113 million tons per annum of active operating capacity, and we've got 33 million tons per annum under construction. And you can see here that it's all spread up and down the coast. And our red dots on this chart are taking us to a couple of interesting LNG terminals that we want to pick out different aspects of how they're being used. First of all, we're going to go to Wenzhou, the LNG receiving terminal. And this is the latest edition, and we've highlighted this one. It is actually, I think, the 26th terminal to start up in China, in Zhejiang province. And its ownership is owned by Zhejiang Energy. They own 3 million tons, the full capacity of that plant. And it's a pipeline network which now extends into East and Central China. And it boosts regional gas supply, and it helps China to achieve its cleaner energy goals. And ExxonMobil will supply about 1 million tons per annum to that terminal long term. So that's the latest edition. We're now going to have a look at the Tianjin floating regas and storage unit, and we're focusing on this one. You'll see on the left-hand side the FSRUs, and on the right-hand side here, 2 big FSRUs from the berthing there. It's quite a large terminal, and it was actually CNOOC's first FSRU. Most regas in China is actually land-based, but this is an example that we've got for you here because it is actually a potential big expansion area for regas in China. It's quite likely that we'll see the shipyards like the Hudong Zhonghe shipyard adopting more FSRUs for a rapid rollout into China. And our next example of LNG in China is the Putian LNG receiving terminal, a terminal which actually has a combined cycle gas-fired power plant adjacent. So it is if you like, it's a total sort of package here, located in the city of Putian in Fujian province. The regas terminal initially had just a 2.5 million ton capacity, and now phase 2 is already in planning. And the natural gas from this terminal is going directly into those power plants around and feeding, I would say, around 5 cities or so in the province. So a lot of diversified usage there for LNG in China. Andy, back to you.
Thank you, Pat. So Qatar and Ras Laffan City is where expansion construction is started by Qatar Energy. They've recently announced even further expansion, very aggressive long-term contracting, especially into China, and different to the US, oil price linked. And we first looked down from space at Ras Laffan City, Charles, a place that you know quite well. We see the trains of Qatar gas from space to the north, and then the RAS gas trains. You can see where Sasol of South Africa built the gas to liquids project. You can see the Dolphin gas processing for the pipeline that flows to Oman. You can see the Pearl gas to liquids facility that converts natural gas into liquid fuels. Charles, you'll recognize that. condensate and LPG storage tanks, and then the condensate splitter that processes condensate. And on the right-hand side, you see the energy liquids and export facility. And the headline of this picture is, and we all need to stand in awe, is this is the world's largest energy export terminal and complex. There is nothing like what you see here in the world. Qatar has said that they will build a further, in that area at least, and we'll see a further a number of trains to go from 77 million tons to 126 million tons, and then recently, as in 2 weeks ago, announced a further 16 to go to 142 million tons, by which time they will not have caught up with the United States. What does it look like at close range in the desert? That's what the RAS gas trains look like when you photograph them from space. It's a hot country, 50 degrees centigrade in the summer, not much cooler in the winter. And all of that gas is fed from the world's largest single non-associated gas field, the so-called North Field, or on the other side of the Gulf, known as the South Pars Field, discovered already in 1971, and they've been in production since 1991. And you see the processing and production platforms as they've been installed in the Gulf of Arabia. Pat, back to you, to Japan.
Yes, so off to Japan now, where, as we've shown here, about 99% of all the natural gas that it uses is imported. And at the moment on the government's agenda is certainly looking at ways of bringing back more nuclear capacity to reduce LNG imports. Japan, up until recently, had been the largest importer in the world, but it has lost that top slot to China. So let's see what the government has in store. It certainly has been elected on an agenda of bringing back more nuclear capacity. And these power plants have pretty much been shut down for a very long time following the Fukushima disaster. And this one here is the world's largest nuclear plant. It's the Kashiwazaki Kariwa nuclear power station. It's got 7 boiling water reactors at 8.2 gigawatts, one of the largest sites globally, owned by Tokyo Electric. So what is happening in the press at the moment, and you may have seen it, is that the plant has been shut down since 2012. But in December of last year, Japan's nuclear power regulator did lift the operational ban imposed on the plant, and it's allowing it to work towards getting the local permission to restart from the local prefecture of Niigata. These things, though, do take time, and just by giving it permission to progress doesn't mean an instant restart. Now, the government really do have a lot of plans to try to bring nuclear power back online in Japan. And if they're very successful, they have an ambitious plan, in my opinion, to try to reduce LNG imports from around 66 million tons at the moment down to about 45 million tons by 2030. I think even the Japanese utility companies feel that that is a very ambitious stretch. And so as a result, they have to look at very, very flexible LNG procurement so that in the event that the government's targets aren't met, they continue to keep energy security maintained. And so what we see here is we see lots of changes in Japan's procurement. And we're going to take you now through some of the terminals and give you some features about what is happening currently. You'll see here, as we look down, on 36 LNG import terminals all around the Japanese coast, constructed to import LNG into coastal cities rather than to have major transit of gas via a national transmission system. And the red dots on this chart show you some of the visits that we're going to make now to different terminals and to give you some different flavors of what's happening. If we go to Sodegawa LNG import terminal, that's in Tokyo, it's the largest in Japan and it's operated by JERA and also Tokyo Gas. And last year it imported around, I would say, about 8 million tons of LNG, and that is planned to be phased down. You'll see on this chart here a lot of storage tanks for receiving LNG. And I would say that what we see here is operated by it's operated by JERA, and they have recently looked at expanding their flexible LNG contracts. You may have seen in the last few weeks that they are buying 15% of equity in the Scarborough field in northwest Australia, which would give them an entitlement of 1.2 million tonnes of flexible LNG. This LNG could be used for Japan, but is also set up so that it can also be traded internationally. You'll see here that there's a lot of gas-fired power plants in Japan, and all of them, as I say, run on imported LNG. We are going to now visit the Futsu. This is an LNG terminal with an associated power plant in Japan, run by TEPCO. And you'll see on the aerial photograph here, we've got the offloading facilities on the right-hand side at the bottom here, the LNG storage tanks, and then adjacent we have the combined cycle power plant. So the Futsu power station is actually the fourth largest gas-fired power station in the world. It operates at 5,000 megawatts, utilizing 4 groups of units and 14 combined cycle units and 4 advanced combined cycle units. The facility is owned, as I said, by TEPCO.
Thank you, Pat. So Russia is currently the world's 4th largest energy producer after, as Pat showed earlier, after the US and Qatar and Australia. We'll come to Australia in a moment. But despite the war, Russian exports have continued undiminished, but the Arctic LNG 2 project has been paused, as we will see in a moment. And let's look down at Russia, and we see from east to west, we see Cyclone Energy now with Shell out of that. We see up in the Arctic Circle, Yamal LNG and Arctic LNG, and we'll visit those in a moment. And then we see, and those were built by Novatek. And then near St. Petersburg, we see the Portovaya LNG plant owned by Gazprom and Gazprom Bank together. And let's visit those 3 plants and just make a few comments about that. This plant already in operation for way more than a decade. You can see an LNG carrier loading. It's just 3 days sailing away from Tokyo, the LNG storage tank and the LNG trains, but it's also a big oil export terminal, and you see the oil storage facilities on the right. The international JV has been nationalized, and the partners now have to apply to maintain their interest, and it leaves especially Mitsubishi and Mitsui in a very difficult position. The second plant that we visit is Yamal LNG, the child of Novatek, an independent Russian LNG player. They took the lead first with Yamal and now with Arctic LNG under extremely difficult construction conditions. In winter, this is dark at all year round and minus 40. You can see the LNG trains and the LNG storage tanks and carrier loading, but Yamal producing at full load from all its trains. Just on the opposite side of the Ob Bay, which is where the Ob River runs into the Arctic area, you see Arctic LNG 2, the Arctic LNG 2 plant. The shareholders in this are Novatek, 60%, and then Total Energies, CNPC of China, Japan Arctic LNG, and Mitsui. And so a lot of people ask, well, where's Arctic LNG 1? Arctic LNG 1 has not been built yet. It is still on the drawing board for Novatek. So this is Arctic LNG 2, 3 trains, 20 million tons. First 2 trains commissioned, but this plant has not produced a cargo yet because the ships are caught up in sanctions. So This plant is completely beset by the combination of US and US sanctions. Third train, and the tanks are full. They've been fully produced, but they cannot ship. The tankers for this needs to come from Korea, built by Hanwha Ocean, formerly Daewoo Shipbuilding, and come also from a Russian yard. And I'm going to, for a moment, just take you to the new yard. And you can see this is Zvezda. You can see on the map on the left-hand corner that sits in Primorsky Krai in the Russian Far East, just north of Vladivostok. And Novatek ordered 15 ice-class carriers that can break through 2 meters of ice by themselves from this yard. And where you see that LNG carrier under construction, that's one of the constructions that are where the hull is completed and it is now being outfitted. That was Russia, and we move to India. Pat.
Yes, back to another demand center in India, and some very idiosyncratic features here in India. Gas is less than 6% of the total fuel mix. And the story for me on India is very much one of largely unfulfilled targets. Let me explain. Slow growth. There are no shortages of LNG import capacity. It stands at 48 million tonnes per annum in service at the moment, and 23 million tonnes per annum is under construction, and 33 million tonnes is planned. Absolutely no shortage of regas capacity. But for a country that's laid down all of this investment, there's only 23 million tonnes of imports in 2023, and 16 million tonnes of those imports were in one terminal alone, Dahej, owned and operated by Petronet. But there's still a drive to build yet more capacity. There's a lot of shortages and chronic delays in connecting the actual LNG receiving facilities with pipeline capacity, and that's beleaguered quite a lot of the terminals which are shown on this chart. Let's go across to Dahej, and I would say this is sort of one of the success stories. It is the one that is owned and operated by Petronet and the one that's most actively used. But a problem for so many Indian gas companies is that India is a very price-sensitive market, and it's one where it's difficult to sell LNG downstream on a long-term basis. Lots of analysts have forecast that Indian LNG supply will grow, and their demand is up, sort of rivaling that of a lot of other countries in the region. But overall, it's been, I would say, one of missed targets continuously. And at the moment, you would say that the prospect here is that there is a lot more activity with Qatar. There's a lot of government-to-government deals here of very long-term, large LNG term contracts. But nevertheless, there's quite a few companies, and we'll cover them here. The Damra LNG most recently commissioned terminal here with LNG tanks. You'll see in the far side of the photograph, the LNG unloading facilities here, but only 500,000 tonnes or so that have actually been received at that terminal to date. Let's move back now to LNG production in Australia.
Yeah, so not long ago, Australia was the largest producer, but significant expansion in Australia has come to an end. We look down at a map of Australia and we see the 10 LNG plants in operation. And I would suspect that as a country, Australia has probably exported more LNG as a country to date than any other. And because it's been exporting from Northwest Shelf that you can see on the left-hand side of your picture on the West Coast since 1989. And currently it's only Pluto that is expanding, with the second train being supplied from Scarborough, as Pat referred to earlier. Let's visit two facilities. We go to Curtis Island on the East Coast, and then we go to the Prelude floating facility. We look down on the three plants, Asia Pacific, Queensland, and Gladstone LNG on Curtis Island. These are the only plants currently in the world operating on coal bed methane. and those cargoes flow to Japan and Korea and China and Malaysia and Singapore, and also lifted by the portfolio players, Total and Shell. Concerns, just because you constantly have to drill in coal bed methane, how long those will run. And then lastly, we turn to the only floating LNG plant in Australia, which is the Prelude One, Shell's first and probably last. I'll explain the last in a moment, which was developed prior to the shale gas revolution in the United States, to commercialize small pockets of offshore gas. But then just the sheer size of the US has kind of overtaken that. And in the background, you can see Prelude floating LNG, and in this picture, offloading onto the LNG carrier next to it. Pat, let's just take it, and we need to push a little bit for time, but take us into import terminals in developing markets.
Yes, so we've covered some of the large importing countries, China, Japan, the whole of the European region. There's a lot of activity going on all around the world, quite frankly, and we don't have time to cover the majority of it. But there's a couple that we want to pick out, and we're going to pick out Pakistan and Philippines as examples of countries that have had long-term, slow-burning ambitions, but are really trying to become part of the emerging markets for the 2020s and the 2030s. So first of all, let's go to Pakistan. And here you see an aerial view of the Port Qasim floating storage and regasification terminal. LNG supply has been going in there for the last sort of 5+ years, but hit a big stumbling block during the European crisis as LNG was being drawn more to Europe. So countries like Pakistan have struggled to continue to buy. Why? Because quite a lot of their LNG supply was spot or it was divertible, and LNG has been moving away to higher value price markets. The rationale for why countries like Pakistan really need LNG is that part of their energy transition is to move from depleting domestic reserves and substitute it with LNG, and to promote power generation from gas. So we expect to see these countries continue to grow, but in 2023, Pakistan only imported 7.2 million tons. If you'd gone back a few years to around 2020, they were aiming for that to be around 20 million tons by now. So certainly starved by LNG supply, and also being a price-sensitive market. For many of you on this call who are long-term in the LNG business, you'll know the story too of how long a gestation period it's been for a country like the Philippines to look at importing LNG. We're pleased to say that that has started, but it has been a very, very long and slow process. Same rationale, taking depleting domestic reserves and trying to bolster gas use in the country by LNG imports. These imports proposed more than 20 years ago, but only really just starting up in the last year or so. And starting up with projects where we have FSRUs and power plants adjacent to them. And the idea here is that this plant here that we're showing you, owned by AG&P, started commissioning in the fourth quarter last year, and I think has imported about 500,000 tons so far, but the plan is for about 3 or 4 others of these types of FSRUs, followed by land-based terminals to develop in the Philippines.
I close by recognizing that there are LNG terminals being developed right now in at least Canada, the USA, Mozambique, Mauritania, Senegal, Congo, Argentina, Tanzania, Mexico, and the UAE. And I'm going to show just impressions of 5 of those. We first go to Kitimat, where the LNG Canada trains are expected to start producing and exporting to Asia in 2025, owned by Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi, and KOGAS, and the first terminal on the US, North American West Coast. Rich Coleman played a major role in getting that done. Coral South in Mozambique, already started up in 2022 as a floating LNG plant. And as you're probably aware, there is the much bigger land-based project at Pemba being developed by Total Energies as Mozambique LNG. We've seen the first cargo in the past few weeks leave the Congo from the Congo LNG plant. Another one of these floaters will go into operation in the Congo, and ENI is playing a major role in developing that. And then we go back to the US and just to show the plant modules already being loaded for the next Venture Global plant at Plaquemines, as Venture Global and Cheniere compete to be the largest US supply company. We go to the shared maritime border between Mauritania and Senegal. And you see here what should have been commissioned and first cargo already last year. You see the floating LNG plant of Tortue. Tortue is Turtle, and you see an LNG carrier there. Probably, I would think, bring in the commissioning cargo late, but will happen, and a fantastic achievement for these countries to, on their border, share an LNG facility. All that LNG that we've just looked at needs to be transported between countries. There are 715 LNG carriers on the water and another 349 on the order book. We look down at probably the most prolific yard in terms of LNG construction in the world, the Samsung Goji yard on the southeast coast of Korea, and you can see there are many construction docks and the ships being outfitted on a quayside. And then in China, very significantly, the Hudong yard in Shanghai is being relocated right now to Shaanxi Island by the Chinese State Shipbuilding Corporation in Shanghai. And you see the industrial construction yards that will be turning out one LNG carrier after the other there. This is also a military construction yard, and you can see an aircraft carrier just below the sign on the right-hand side, and a very large number of ships being outfitted. Massive building programs with an order book of more than 60 ships right now. Pat, please take us to closure.
Yes, and to closure here, I think my last sort of remarks is that LNG is very much a demand-led business. And really what gives us the license to continue to grow and develop is really how important LNG is going to be in the energy transition as a transition fuel itself. It has to be affordable, it has to be sustainable, and it has to be, in my opinion, relatable. Relatable is because not just to our industry to show how compelling it is and how useful it is to act as a supporting fuel to renewables, but also to all of those countries where we're looking for growth. We're looking for growth predominantly in Asia, and we have to realize that LNG has to be the cleanest version of itself. It has to decarbonize. And if it can decarbonize, then it really does have a compelling argument to be a long-term transition fuel. And I close really with the last slide, which is the slide which was given to us by Woodmac so that we could present that to you this afternoon, to show that there are lots of areas between the upstream, venting, liquefaction, shipping and regas, where the amount of emissions is very variable from plant to plant. These bar charts show you with these little turquoise squares here what the average is, but the range is quite huge. So not all LNG is equal. And also there's a lot of scope and a lot of work being done, I think, to try to ensure that we decarbonize the LNG supply chain. Now, the units I'm showing you here between upstream to regasification in total produce about 26% of all of the emissions associated with gas, with LNG. So what we're saying is that there's a lot of scope 3 emissions in actually burning the fuel itself by the end users. But it's our responsibility in the industry to try to make sure that scope 1 and 2 emissions for all the LNG that we produce going through the energy transition over the next 10, 20, 30 years is the cleanest version of itself. And when you look back at this slide after this presentation, you'll see that there is quite a lot of scope to decarbonize. And that, I believe, will keep us relatable for the future. So with that, I think we've now taken you on a whirlwind tour of all of a variety of facilities and a variety of markets. I'll hand back to Mary to help us close the event and maybe some questions.
Thank you so much, Pat and Andy, and for the comprehensive presentation and all of